Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm John Pinero, Director of Research at the Acton Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Acton Lecture Series, which today is being done in conjunction with the Research Department's Colloquium on Christian Social Thought, sponsored by the Journal of Markets and Morality, which is Acton Institute's refereed academic journal. Our format here will be a 30-minute lecture, followed by 30 minutes for question and answer. We're live streaming the lecture, so during question and answer, it's very important that you wait for the microphone to be passed to you to ask your question, and when it is passed to you, you use it to ask your question. We have a bookshop over here to my right. That'll be open until 1:30. I encourage you to stop by the bookshop and take a look at what we have to offer. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Micah Watson is a native of the great Golden State of California, but is grateful to now call Grand Rapids, Michigan home, along with his wife Julie and their 5 children, and now 1 son-in-law. He is also the Paul Henry Chair in the Study of Christianity and Politics at Calvin University, where he also directs the Henry Institute in the program in Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. He is contributing editor at Public Discourse and the co-author of C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Natural Law, and the forthcoming Hopeful Realism, Evangelical Natural Law, and Democratic Politics. He has been privileged to partner with think tanks and institutes, including several events with the Acton Institute. His research interests include also the political thought of C.S. Lewis. Welcome, Dr. Watson.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Dylan, for putting this confab together, and thanks to all of you who have taken time out of your day to join us in this great room to have this conversation. Hope these stay on. 30 miles north of Dublin, in Lewis's native Ireland, there's a town of around 40,000 plus called Drogheda, though I think it would take a real Irishman or woman to pronounce that correctly. It was a town that was well known to the Lewis brothers, both to Warnie Lewis and his rather better well-known brother Jack, or C.S. Lewis as he's known to us. To put the matter rather matter-of-factly, Warnie was an alcoholic. And if he got past his brother's watchful eye and crossed the Irish Sea, he would frequently go on benders, to the extent that he would often spend several weeks to several months at the Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital in Drogheda, a hospital founded by the Sisters of the Medical Missionary of Mary. Lewis, Jack Lewis that is, referred to the sisters as charming nuns who had taken such good care of his brother time and time again. It was during one of those extended stays that the sisters asked Lewis to write a short note about the mission of the sisters while staying at the White Horse Inn, a hotel founded in 1755, unfortunately was a victim of COVID a few years ago and is now shut down. That short note was first published in a book about the medical missionaries of Mary, an order that still today serves the vulnerable around the world. Lewis's essay was later published with the rather pedestrian title of Some Thoughts in the collection of Lewis's essays, God in the Dock. Lewis begins with the observation that there's nothing more obvious to us than a Christian hospital, with the possible exception of a Christian church. In addition to blessing marriage and fostering arts and philosophy, Christianity has always been healing the sick and caring for the poor. When I do this, I'm trying to quote Lewis directly, just to distinguish. It is always either doing or at least repenting with shame for not having done all the things which secular humanism enjoins. Looking at Christianity through one lens, we see that Christianity preserved civilization after the fall of Rome, protected and furthered the rule of law, etc., has made all sorts of great cultural things possible. And Lewis says we can say that Christianity belongs among the great world-affirming religions. But through another lens, we can say just the opposite. The central image of Christian faith is a man slowly dying by torture. And the instrument of that torture has become the worldwide symbol of that faith. Martyrdom is honored, if not always celebrated, among Christians. And while there are feast days, there are also fast days. John just mentioned some of us may be fasting. Christianity teaches that we put our treasure not in this world, but in the next. Every year, many of us put dust on our foreheads and acknowledge that to dust we shall return. Christianity, by this lens, perhaps belongs to the great world-denying religions, like Buddhism. Non-Christians, Lewis thinks, must be bewildered by this juxtaposition. But Christians from the inside see that these two aspects of faith, while perhaps paradoxical, are reconcilable because ours is a hierarchical universe. That is, it is ordered. Without mentioning Augustine explicitly, Lewis waxes Augustinian in noting that the supernatural is higher than the natural, but each has its place, just as a man is higher than a dog, but a dog has its place. We should not be surprised then, he goes on, that healing the sick and providing for the poor give way sometimes to the salvation of souls. Yet the created nature, the natural, still has its place. And because God created it out of his love and artistry, it demands our reverence. It is only after this rather meaty meditation that Lewis returns to what these nurses are actually doing, fighting against death, earnestly, calmly, skillfully. But why do this if death is ultimately going to die anyway? Why worry so much about the sick bay on the Titanic? Why worry about death and sickness and poverty, Lewis asks, given the higher priority of the supernatural and saving souls? Well, why did Jesus weep at the death of Lazarus, even knowing he would raise him up a few minutes later? Lewis suggests Jesus weeps because death disturbs him as the author of life and mere nature even more than it disturbs us. And while the war against death was won at Calvary, so long as mere nature remains infected by sin and death, there are many battles yet to be waged against it. Because we know, Lewis writes, that the natural level also is God's creation, we cannot cease to fight against the death that mars it, against pain and poverty, barbarism and ignorance. Because we love something else more than the world, we love even the world better than those who know no other. The problem with giving talks about Lewis is one often drifts into just quoting him over and over. One of Lewis's great gifts is his keen ability to help us see things from just a slightly different angle, such that we might say, well, of course that's how it is. How did I not see that before? He reminds us of things we felt like we've known under the surface, and at other times he takes us to a new vista of belief or insight that we might never have come to on our own. And so when it comes to the matter of social morality, or the social question, or the problem of poverty, or inequality, or however one wants to describe the dis-ease we feel when we think about the pervasive and stubborn reality of poverty, particularly when we consider just how much wealthier the world is as a whole than it was just a couple hundred years ago. The poor have always and always will be with us, and yet we know we are called to care about the poor. The parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25 frames this calling as having rather high stakes. There's way more to be said about Lewis's thoughts about politics and social challenges. We've heard some already, and we'll hear some more throughout the day. One could even write a book about the matter and not exhaust it. But in our remaining time together, I want to focus on three things. First, and briefly, did Lewis care about or address the social question? Second, what did Lewis mean when he wrote in Mere Christianity that the church ought to give us a lead, from whence I take the title for today? And third, what might Lewis tell us we can do? Does he give us any hints as what we can do moving forward, given what he thinks about our moment and what he thinks about this juxtaposition between the reality that death has been defeated at Calvary and yet these battles remain to be fought, that we are called to think and work about these challenges? Did Lewis care about the social question, or perhaps better put, did he care about issues of class? The answer is, I think, pretty clear, yes. Did Lewis address class or the social problem in any sustained or focused way? Did he write a treatment of class conflict, or a treatise on public policy, or the best means to alleviate poverty? I think the answer is no. So we have to temper our expectations for what we'll find in Lewis when it comes to the sort of guidance or hints we can expect. It's entirely possible for a figure to, one, think an issue is important, and yet, two, not treat that issue in any sustained way. Thus, in the chapter in Mere Christianity, and I want to shout out to the discussion of Richard Baxter earlier, from whom Lewis took the term Mere Christianity. In that chapter on social morality, Lewis notes the wisdom of the ancient Greeks, the Old Testament Jews, and the great Christian teachers of the Middle Ages, who all agreed that lending money at interest is a really bad idea. Lewis notes how at odds this wisdom is with the modern practice of interest, which he describes as the basis of our whole system. Now, it could be, Lewis notes, that the ancients were mistaken and could not have known about the wonders of the joint stock company. But he also admits he is not an economist, and so he merely raises the question and says we need the Christian economist to help us out. He would heartily approve, I think, of the mission of the Acton Institute in helping to play that role. Once we are on the look for it, we find Lewis caring about class and poverty throughout his works and in his life. While raised comfortably middle class, Lewis was not sequestered from the challenges of the working class and the working poor. His father was a solicitor in Belfast, a lawyer who worked with the police and often brought his work back home with him. Even though Oxford bound, Lewis served in World War I alongside soldiers of all backgrounds. As a Don at Oxford, he taught political philosophy, including Rousseau, Marx, and Lenin as late as 1939. He wrote an early essay on Bolshevism. Just to be clear, he was not a fan, but he could recognize that the problems that could give rise to Bolshevism might be worth considering, even if the solutions of Bolshevism were not sound. During World War II, he gave talks to rank-and-file members of the RAF. He answered letters from hundreds and hundreds of people from all walks of life, some of whom encountered great difficulties with financial and medical problems. He also gave away a great deal of his own money, so much so that when his books started to take off as bestsellers, the British version of the IRS did not count charitable giving as lessening your tax burden. He had a massive tax bill and had to get some help to make sure he wouldn't get dinged in the future. His friendship and then marriage to Joy Davidman Gresham helped him see how difficult life could be for a divorcee formerly abused by her ex-husband with 2 young boys to raise. He did live a sort of remarkably rich life amidst the gleaming spires of Oxford, but he was not cloistered there. We see this also in his writings. In the very first book he wrote after becoming a Christian, The Pilgrim's Regress, the main character, John, meets the character of Mother Kirk, Lewis's stand-in for the Christian church. and the Christian church, through the voice of Mother Kirk, describes how business is done between the classes when it comes to property. She says, "The little people do not know the big people to whom they belong. The big people do not intend that they should. No important transference of property could be carried out at all if the small people at the bottom knew what was really happening." Later on, John meets history, a venerable character who relates to him the sweep and scope of the human story. According to history of the character, the Enlightenment began to go downhill once Mr. Mammon was taking it over and building new towns and turning the people out of the fields and into the factories. The factories gave us machines, about which another character in this book says, "Their labor-saving devices multiply drudgery, their aphrodisiacs make them impotent, their amusements bore them, their rapid production of food leaves half of them starving, and their devices for saving time have banished leisure from the country." With the exception of the quip about food and starvation, that's a pretty accurate prophecy from 1933 about some aspects of our modern life today. We could find more examples throughout Lewis's fiction and his essays. That Hideous Strength has a remarkable portrayal of a hierarchical society, community at St. Anne's that is nevertheless remarkably egalitarian when it comes to class. One of the main characters, Jane Studdock, is bewildered when a working class woman, Mrs. Maggs, is treated as her equal, even though Mrs. Maggs is a domestic and her husband is a convicted criminal. And speaking of criminals, perhaps Lewis's only foray into the weeds of public policy is found in his The Humanitarian Theory of Punishment, in which he defends the rights of criminals to be treated as real men and women and not things or patients to be played with by the authority of the state for its rather than their purposes. And in one of the most moving visions in his Great Divorce, Lewis introduces us to a woman whose appearance is so splendid and her entourage so transcendent that Lewis, the narrator in the story, wonders if she is the mother of our Lord. She is not, Lewis's guide tells Lewis. You will never have heard of her. Her name was Sarah Smith, and while she is not great as greatness is understood on earth, heaven's economy is rather different, and her true greatness was found in her modesty and charity and kindness that had nothing to do with class status. As evidenced by the essay about the Irish hospital with which I began, Lewis did care about poverty and class, and even politics as an attempt to grapple with those things. What did he think about the church's role in doing so? Here we need another reminder from Lewis about the angle we're seeing things from or with. We can be tempted when we hear the church to think of the human, all too human manifestation of the church. The abuses, the scandals, the times it has let us down, the human and fallen institutions that are made up of sinful human beings. And of course, we know, those of us who are in the church, that we ourselves contribute to that angle with our own frailty and fallenness and the crooked timber of our humanity. But what we see or feel when we hear the church and think of those things is not the church as it truly is. As Screwtape reminds us in the second letter to Wormwood in the letters that bear his name, the church is spread out throughout all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners, a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy. He goes on to say, fortunately, it is quite invisible to these humans. Screwtape may be right that we cannot see the bride of Christ yet in all her glory, her actual glory, but we do well to try to remember that reality as we grapple with the disappointment we sometimes feel with the earthly church as it is in this temporal and temporary moment. And this is particularly important to remember when we think about the church's role with politics and poverty. Lewis addresses the role of the church most directly in his chapter on social morality in Mere Christianity. And in this chapter, originally spoken over the air or the wireless, as a BBC radio address during World War II, Lewis notes two important things before discussing the church. First, that Jesus did not come to preach a new morality. The golden rule is, Lewis believed, known by everyone, whether they get it from divine scripture or from the natural law written on their hearts. The second thing, he says, is that Christianity tells us about ends, but not always means. He says, when it tells you to feed the hungry, it does not give you lessons in cookery. When it tells you to read the scriptures, it does not give you lessons in Hebrew or Greek or even English grammar. It was never intended to replace or supersede the ordinary human arts and sciences. It is rather a director which will set them all in the right jobs and a source of energy which will give them all new life, if only they will put themselves at its disposal. And here Lewis observes what many people were saying then, and more people are saying now. The church should give us a lead. Now here again, it depends on what angle we're looking at. If by the church this means the institutional church, and in particular the clergy, should give us a political or policy lead, then Lewis thinks this is a very bad idea indeed. The clergy have been specially trained to look after what concerns us as creatures who are going to live forever, not to determine what it looks like to put the golden rule into action such that we can fight the battle against death and poverty and injustice on the earthly plane. But if what people mean by the church is the whole body of practicing Christians, then Lewis thinks this is much more promising. If Christians who are also economists and political scientists and public policy wonks and think tank enthusiasts who promote a free and virtuous society, if those Christians put their effort into putting the golden rule into action, then we will make some progress toward Christian solutions to our social problems. But we want to ask, does Lewis give us anything more specific that we can go do? And the answer is yes. He's already addressed that to some extent, and we already know some of these answers. Our role as practicing Christians as a part of the church universal can be to be good nurses, economists, accountants, firefighters, and just about any job, formal or not, that contributes to the common good of the natural world that God has created and called us to cultivate. But Lewis does describe an idea that is, to my mind, rather intriguing, if it is at the same time rather daunting. Then and now, Christians, when things weren't going well, could be tempted not only by the prospect of the institutional church taking the lead, but by the church taking control. In the dark early years of the Second World War, Catholic thinker Jacques Maritain and Lewis both considered and rejected Christian political parties as a viable solution to the ills of modernity. Lewis wrote a brief essay titled Meditation on the Third Commandment just a couple years before Mere Christianity was published. And in it, he borrows explicitly from Maritain's book, Scholasticism and Politics. In a chapter called Catholic Action and Political Action, Maritain distinguishes three layers of Catholic activity. The first concerns the ongoing and strictly spiritual ministries of the Catholic Church as the Catholic Church, or the spiritual, administering the sacraments, hearing confessions, things like that. The second is the actions of Catholic citizens in the earthly realm regarding mundane matters affecting everyone in society, the temporal. And the third layer is where the formal church is somehow engaged with the temporal matter insofar as the church's teachings or practices directly intersects with the political matter. So think of Fulton v. Philadelphia, the case of Catholic social services being involved with adoption services in Philadelphia, or in the 60s when Archbishop Rummel of New Orleans excommunicated 3 Catholic Democratic bosses for continuing to defend segregation in schools. The second layer, though, the temporal, is what Maritain refers to as the political, and this is what Lewis means when he refers to the church being involved, where the church is comprised of all practicing Christians. For reasons that Lewis shared, Maritain was wary of a Catholic party operating in the name of the church in partisan politics, yet Maritain did offer a suggestion as to what Catholics might do as a voting bloc that would avoid the dangers of a Christian party while still practicing faithful Christian citizenship. Monsieur Maritain has hinted, Lewis writes in his essay, at the only way in which Christianity, as opposed to schismatics blasphemously claiming to represent it, can influence politics. What was Maritain's hint? Faithful Catholic citizenship can be found, Maritain writes, not by taking sides for a certain political idea of the political common good, judged more favorable to religion, nor by making Catholics as such enter upon the service of historical forces and temporal interests linked to this idea. It is rather by laying every political camp whatsoever under the necessity of respecting those rights and values, if it does not wish to be fought by the Catholic masses. And he goes on to say that this procedure will rise above the particularities of parties, but still hold those parties to account. I have a long quote here, which I'm going to skip. Maritain's chapter is one heavily conceptual offering in a book that contains several vigorously argued and in-depth chapters. So Lewis is right to refer to Maritain's Christian, called a Christian veto option, as only a hint, as he does not expound on it at any length. Nevertheless, Lewis endorsed and briefly expanded on this hint in his Third Commandment essay, and the brevity of Lewis's treatment should not diminish the strength of his endorsement. Lewis, as a mere Christian, broadens Maritain's idea to include not just Roman Catholics, but Christians generally, what he calls an interdenominational Christian voters' society that might draw up a list of assurances about ends and means which every member was expected to exact from any political party as the price of his support. Now, drawing up this list of assurances would have been quite the ecumenical challenge in Lewis's day, to put it mildly, and surely the challenge would be, if anything, even greater today. Nevertheless, Lewis did describe this possibility as the only way Christians as Christians might engage politically in a healthy way. He went so far to write in an Anglican newspaper that he was prepared in principle for membership and obedience to be obligatory on Christians. Now, I'm not persuaded that this notion is the only way for Christians to engage politics well, nor am I persuaded that membership should be a strict religious duty. Yet the proposal does offer one way for Christians to influence society for the good without attaching the name and reputation of Jesus Christ and his church to the partisan tumult of mundane political wrangling. This is what Lewis meant by invoking the Third Commandment. Attaching Jesus' name to a particular party takes that name in vain. Such a proposal, this interdenominational Christian voter society, would invert the political dynamics that threaten the integrity of the church while preserving the democratic emphasis on the consent of the governed. Instead of candidates from a Christian party seeking to persuade the electorate to buy into their religiously grounded values and policy prescriptions, potential power brokers seeking political office would need to persuade members of a Christian voter society that they would respect their convictions, and they could be held accountable electorally if they did not. The failure of politics or a policy would not be directly tied to any particular denomination or group of Christians, even as Christian interest groups and Christian citizens could still freely influence the political process, run for office, volunteer for campaigns, donate to candidates, put those signs in the lawns that we're seeing all over town. I want to conclude the last couple minutes with one last angle from which to consider these matters, and that's the angle that Lewis borrowed from a friend and involves the image of the book-line study. We're in the perfect room for this. The book-line study on the one hand, and the proverbial and disreputable smoke-filled room of backroom politics on the other. Now, Lewis's antipathy towards politicians is well known and well grounded. We see evidence of this throughout his fiction and his personal life. My favorite example is in The Silver Chair. Eustace and Jill go to this progressive school, and they have a lunatic headmaster who is fired after failing miserably as a headmaster, and then is fired again after failing miserably as a school inspector, and is finally sent off to Parliament, where Lewis writes, "She lived happily ever after." Given Lewis's own experience with horrid schoolmasters, this is not a pretty portrait for members of Parliament. And 6 days before he died in November of 1963, Lewis responded to a Mrs. Frank Jones, noting that, "Our papers at the moment are filled with nothing but politics, a subject in which I cannot take any interest." But immediately after declaring his indifference to politics, he goes on to lament the inevitability of a forthcoming and likely long-lasting labor government through the regimentation, austerity, and meddling which they so enjoy. The death of Sir Stafford Cripps, he said, the late nursery governors of England would make things a little bit better. In these snippets and anecdotes, Lewis proclaims both ignorance of and hostility towards politics, though it is a paradoxically well-informed ignorance and a moth drawn to the flame hostility. That said, even Lewis recognized that his antipathy to politicians might have been somewhat overwrought. In 1956, 3 years after The Silver Chair was published, Lewis offered high praise to his friend Chad Walsh's book, Behold the Glory, noting in a letter to Walsh that the bit he needed most was the book's qualified defense of politicians. Walsh had likened politicians to physicians, medical doctors, we might include nurses, most of whom do the best they can given the materials they have. Some are stupid, others wicked, but this does not distinguish them as a class from any other class of human beings. And many do attempt to do some good in a limited earthly way. The politician, like the physician, must be able to move between the God-given design of a healthy body or a healthy body politic and the reality that both bodies are diseased. A doctor ignorant of what health looks like would not be of much help to the sick, and a doctor who recoiled from the horrors of cancer or gangrene would not be of much help to them either. In the same way, the good politician must understand what the healthy body politic looks like, and Walsh here cites the city of God as the ideal. But the good politician must also be willing to squarely face the dirty realities of politics as they exist in a fallen world. He or she must be well acquainted with the ideal, which is learned in the book-line study, but not be reluctant to dive into the smoke-filled room, where the good politician cannot help but be struck by how far the earthly political reality is from the ideal of the city of God, yet nevertheless rolls up his or her sleeves and gets to work. Lewis did not write very much about Walsh's chapter, and I don't want to draw too much from it, but I do think it matters. I do want to suggest that this dynamic between the idea of the book-line study and the sordid goings-ons of the smoke-filled room help us understand Lewis's purported disdain for politics and his lifelong interest in political themes. There are biological diseases, wounds, viruses, and other ailments that mar our physical health. And to address those things, doctors and nurses, like those at Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital, practice the healing arts. Similarly, there's violence, injustice, wrongful inequality, and poverty, and a host of other ills that afflict the body politic. And to address those things, Lewis calls on ordinary Christians practicing the ordinary human arts and sciences to put "do as you would be done by" into action. We do well to remember on this side of eternity, we need to go back and forth between those two rooms, reminding ourselves of the ideals taught in the book-line study, but entering into the busyness and messiness of things and applying those ideals with prudence in the smoke-filled room. Notice the book-line study is available to all, not just one denomination. There's a mereness to it that is attractive. We must avoid being captured entirely into one room or the other. For all the many gifts Lewis had and all the genres his work fits into, he did not undertake the role of politician or economist or public policy wonk. Nevertheless, his most valuable work for those in the Christian tradition was in laying out the framework, setting up the chess pieces in such a way as to connect Christian faith and doctrine with the categories of thinking and doing necessary to engage the modern world. It is up to us, he might say, to actually move those pieces. Thank you. All right, we have time for Q&A.
Does Lewis ever say how he voted or if he voted?
So I'll punt some. I don't know that he ever says how he voted. I'd want to go through. There's 3 volumes of his letters, and he might say in there someplace that he voted this way or the other. He was seen as on the more conservative side. Okay, so a couple anecdotes that illustrate this. One is Winston Churchill wanted to give him a Commander of the British Empire award, and Lewis turned it down, saying that this will give ammunition to my leftist critics who say I'm just giving political propaganda. And one of those leftist critics was George Orwell. Lewis and Orwell knew of each other. Lewis reviewed Animal Farm in 1984. Orwell reviewed That He Is Strength. It's rather quite entertaining to see what they each said about each other. He did write in a letter to his brother, I wish that there was a stagnation party we could vote for, that at the end of term would brag about having done nothing whatsoever. So his instincts were very much, were pretty libertarian, get off my lawn, leave us alone. That's complicated a little bit as he got older, as he met Joy David Gresham, as he answered letters, where he at one point he gets a letter from an American woman in Florida. She is, if you're familiar with the book Letters from an American Lady, this is the woman who wrote him, I think, 3 times a week. And he finally, I asked for help to respond because it was too much. But she was talking about how she'd fallen on some terrible medical situation and she was just out of luck. And he said, for all the hard things I've said about our national health services in Britain, at the least, it's better than nothing. Almost a little bit of a nod towards subsidiarity. That at the federal level is not where you want it to have, but at least there's something there. So I don't know that he says exactly who he would have voted for, but his instincts were on the more conservative side of things.
Hi, Micah. Thanks. Great talk. So many things I want to interact with, but a quick question about Lewis and Maritain. My understanding and what I've seen in some of his letters is he took Maritain and neo-scholasticism in general as elitist, unnecessarily obscure, obnoxious in certain ways. But I hear you saying he was interacting with some of Maritain's ideas and expanding on them, but perhaps I misinterpreted that. Do you have anything else to say about like what Lewis thought about Maritain and how that impinged on what he was saying about Maritain on politics?
Yeah, I cannot give a great answer as to what he would think about Maritain overall. I wouldn't contradict what you've just said, only to say that it would be very Louisian for him to perhaps have those views, but also find something really helpful in what Maritain had written. He opens up that Meditation of the Third Commandment saying that the ink is barely dried on scholasticism and politics, and yet people are talking about, Christian parties. And myself, just when I learned about this and I was digging into Lewis, let me get this book, and I'm reading it, and it is not super clear. Let's put it that way. And so Lewis did have as you know, he would often say, if you cannot explain something that's complicated to a lay audience, you really don't understand it. So I wouldn't be surprised if he thought that was true about Maritain in some respects, because Scholasticism and Politics is just a dense book. We need dense books, that's fine, but Lewis really had, I think, a heart and a skill towards taking ideas that are complex and making them accessible to a public audience. So, yeah.
This will be an easy question. Can you hypothesize on Lewis's response to, say, the COVID-19 epidemic and the world response, as well as the American response / panic?
Oh, gosh.
Very easy.
Yeah, that's an easy question. I always know when someone starts off with that it's not going to be an easy question. I want to say, and Jordan, we had a paper on that. So last fall or the fall before, we had at Calvin an abolition of man confab, and there was a paper drawing from Lewis and addressing that thought. Richard Turnbull wrote a paper on that exact topic. So that would be my if I'm going to punt. You can email me. We can, and that's published in a journal that's accessible. So there, I think would be a good in-depth treatment of that. I think he would have found much of the response, both from a governmental perspective and from a cultural perspective, to be troubling. He has an essay, "Is This Learning in Wartime?" Where he says, is that the essay where he talks about we need to keep on doing the normal things even though death looms. That's always been the case, right? So whether it's a virus or war or the threat of atomic war, We've always known that we were only going to be here for so long, and how do we use our time given that? So I think he probably would have had some, that would have. In fact, I think people passed around some of those essays as the pandemic was happening. And then, yeah, he was worried about what he would sometimes call the omnicompetent state, and that technocrats would get ahead of themselves and take way more. That during an emergency, they would take more power, and then when the emergency passed, they would be reluctant to give it up. So I think he would have had some real criticisms. At the same time, he has one essay about, so one of the last essays he wrote, it's in The God in the Dock, and he does acknowledge that there is great need. So it's not as if when government overreaches that it's always just purely power-hungry folks twirling their mustaches. There are legitimate needs and problems to which it seems like the government should be trying to do something. So in the end of his career, he came to recognize that tension, even though instinctually, and I think where he ultimately landed was he was more in favor of a limited government and freedom.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. A question that I've thought through and that I think the church wrestles with is which principles of Christianity ought to be advocated for as binding laws for all of the country in a pluralist society versus which should be pushed internally in the church in the context of discipleship. So thou shalt not murder, probably for everyone, but does Lewis have any principles that could speak to where we draw the line on that question?
Yeah, so Lewis is a natural law guy. He doesn't always call it that. He uses the word, the Tao, Chinese word in Abolition of Man. He does address this in different places. I actually think, and I am reluctant to disagree with Lewis, but I don't think he's infallible. I think in Mere Christianity, he talks about how he would not want the Christian view of marriage to be English law, and he says the same way I would not want he says Mahometan, but the Islamic view of wine to be English law. And in that sense, he's giving us a hint, I think the right way to think about it. Are there things that are particularly Christian, like Sabbath observance, right, that we should follow ourselves and maybe even have church discipline for ourselves, that we wouldn't expect everyone to agree on? And I think in one place he quotes Jesus, who refuses to settle the inheritance problem between the two brothers. Who am I to do that, right? And Paul says, don't take your conflict to the judge. We should be figuring these things out ourselves. Can any human being as such know from the law written on their hearts, taking Paul's language from Romans, that it's wrong to abuse one's spouse, to neglect one's children, to lie? And I think the answer is yes. I think that's the answer we see in Scripture, and I think it helps us understand why people all over the world, even if they haven't heard of the Christian Scriptures, can know certain things that are true morally. The reason I say I think Lewis is mistaken in his application is because I think marriage is one of those things that can be known through our natural reason in terms of how it's supposed to be set up. And this gets into a little bit of the Tolkien-Lewis weeds, but the two of them had a pretty significant disagreement about that. Tolkien writes a letter to Lewis criticizing that bit in Mere Christianity, but never sent it. But we now have it. And then Lewis's own marriage was a bit unorthodox in its origin, and Tolkien had some problems with that too. But now I'm going off into kind of gossipy weeds, so I'll stop. So it's a great question. I actually think that's one of the things that is for Christians who are living in a society in the West that's becoming more pluralistic, less Christian in its orientation. Not that it ever was purely Christian, but the Christian things are taken less for granted, that we really have to do some hard work on that delineating line. There's not a blueprint for it. I think it's going to be a matter of prudence, looking at the convictions that God has given us, which aren't to be changed, but the means by which we manifest them in a pluralistic society may adjust depending on the circumstances.
You started to answer this already, but it's easy for us to make a connection between Lewis's critique of scientism and his critique of government, I think, later on. Does he ever make that connection? Does he see that, in some ways, the emerging scientism is also informing the growth of the administrative state and how things are going in Britain?
Yeah, he has a line or a paragraph, and he looks at this historically. He says, Whatever ism has the cultural currency, that's what people will exploit when they want to take power. So it's been the witch doctor in tribal societies, it's been the church in Middle Ages, and he says, now I fear it's going to be science, right? It's going to be technocrats listening to what the science is, which if we're going back to the COVID question, could make for an interesting diversion. And so I think he's right about that, right? Believe the science. I mentioned those. We have the political signs on lawns. Well, there's the one on, basically the liturgy in this house we believe in. Well, science, and as if science just kind of settles it. And I'm not a scientist. My understanding, though, at least from the scientists I know, is that the whole point of science is to be able to test things and hold them up to question and try and keep working through the process rather than just use it as a fiat sort of answer. So I think he does definitely directly connect those two things, and that's what he's most worried about, at least as he's towards the end of his life. He begins to really become pretty despondent about democracy, and he sees part of the problem is this rise. We mentioned that hideous strength, in the bad guys in that hideous strength. For those of you who are not familiar with, sometimes it's called the Space Trilogy. There's some great Lewis scholars who don't like that. They call it the Ransom Trilogy. But in the third book, it's about this governmental agency in Britain called the NICE, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. And there actually is an NICE in Britain right now, but I think it's about healthcare. And it's basically going to take over and kind of run things from science, but using governmental power. So he was very much worried about that and kind of immortalized it in the third of that trilogy. So. Any other questions?
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So you mentioned, thank you. You mentioned George Orwell and Lewis, and one of the, as you just alluded to, one of the kind of darkly delightful aspects of that hideous strength is a kind of Orwellian sort of politics in the English language theme throughout it, right? And he's kind of playing with the bureaucratic redefinition of words and things like that. And I was wondering if you could kind of, you mentioned that Lewis and Orwell were commenting on each other's works. Does Lewis, outside of his fiction, does he have a kind of equivalent of politics in the English language and kind of reflecting on the effect of kind of language on the public square?
Yeah. I think we've talked a little bit about or we mentioned the abolition of man. The opening lecture, The Abolition of Man, those were 3 lectures given in 1943 at the then University of Durham. He starts off by talking about a grammar book for English schoolboys and how language gets perverted. And he's critiquing what he calls in that book, in the abolition lectures and in the book, he calls it the Green Book. But actually we know what the book is. It's called The Control of Language. And in that treatment of that first lecture, he goes at great lengths to show how damaging the misuse of language can be in stultifying the growth of young people, such that it's twisted. Now he likes Orwell's, I don't know that he mentions politics in the English language. He did not like 1984. He thought that Orwell, it was too prurient in the sexual details, but he loved the appendix at the end where Orwell goes through Newspeak. So he certainly endorsed that. I'd have to think about whether in other essays, he was a literary critic, and that was, he was a professional. He's a scholar of those things, and so that's where one would want to look. You could even look at the Allegory of Love, which is one of his in the Guild books. Oxford University Press got him to write the Oxford History of the English Language of the 16th Century, excluding poetry, which he referred to as the Oh Hell book, because it was such a long book. So he's doing that all the time. Whether he has anything as focused and pithy as Orwell's essay, I don't think so. But don't hold me to that. I'll probably remember on the way home and kick myself for getting it wrong on the live stream.
In both the abolition of man as well as mere Christianity, Lewis had a lot to say about subjectivism and objectivism. And we can almost fast forward 70 years, 80 years later and see how those concepts that he was combating in the Abolition of Men, and even in the Green Book of controlled thought, playing out in today's society. Political correctness, very much subjective thought coming out of our universities and high schools and grade schools even. So in light of your topical theme, I'm interested, what role should the church be taking lead on today to combat subjectivism, particularly as it's penetrating our churches today even, as opposed to having people think more through objective thought? And it seems like either the church is ignoring this role in society or has decided not to play it. So I guess I would wonder, fast forwarding 80 years from when he wrote during World War II, what C.S. Lewis would suggest to the church today in light of his thought process in the 40s.
Yeah. So small question. So I mentioned in my talk the second Screwtape letter. In the first letter that Screwtape writes to Wormwood, he chastises him for trying to use logical arguments to. So if you haven't read Screwtape letters, it's marvelous. It gets Lewis on the cover of Time magazine in 1948. John Cleese does an audio version, if you didn't know, and that's marvelous. So you can listen to it in the car. But he chides. The concept is Screwtape is a senior demon giving advice to a junior demon on how to guide his patient, a human being, to hell. Right. So it's brilliantly done. Lewis said he had a hard time writing it because he didn't like getting into the mindset of hell. It was very, very dry and gritty. But he says, you're doing this all wrong. You're using logical argument. And it used to be a couple generations ago, humans, if they thought something was wrong, they changed their minds about it. They don't do that anymore. So you need to be appealing to his feelings. You need to be appealing to the zeitgeist. You need to be appealing to the vibe, which is an overused word today. And so, yeah, I think you're exactly right. Lewis, his read of even in the 40s was, we no longer think in kind of robust, logical categories such that we would change our mind, our behavior if we were proved that we were wrong. And you can look at his writings. He has a number of books that are in that rational mode of apologetics. He's got a treatise on miracles. He has the problem of pain. He has the abolition of man. Mere Christianity, which is more of it's directed towards a lay audience, right? It's originally radio addresses that went out to everybody. But eventually Lewis kind of shifts his focus on what he writes. And among Lewis scholars, a debate on when that was. Some people say when he delivered, he helped found the Socrates Society at Oxford, which got the best Christians and the best atheists and agnostics, and they just debated. It would have been wonderful to be there. He gives a version of his miracles paper there, and he is his respondent is Gertrude Elizabeth Margaret Anscombe, who is by some accounts one of the most brilliant philosophers of the last 100 years, and certainly the most brilliant female philosopher, or at least one of them. There's a couple others that would compete with her. And she just kind of takes his argument apart. And so some scholars think that after that he still believes in reason, but he focuses more on imagination. He has a line that reason is the organ of truth, imagination is the organ of meaning. And he talks about how when he was in his non-Christian phase, he could smell out an argument for faith like that, and immediately he says, my guard would be up. But a story for Lewis got past what he called those watchful dragons. He read George MacDonald, the Scottish mystic and preacher's Fantastes. Before he was a Christian, he said it baptized his imagination. So what Lewis gave then was stories and letters to Malcolm, fiction, thinking that that's what the church needed at that time. So a long way of getting around to your question. I actually think the church can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we should be encouraging rational, logical apologetics and good thinking. But I also think the church should be continuing, it does some of this, but to tell the beautiful story in different ways of what's true and meaningful and good, and noble and beautiful, and give our young people and ourselves examples that are inspiring and motivating I don't think there'll ever be another C.S. Lewis, but there can be men and women who do the kind of work that he did on the logical and on the imaginative plane. I think this is going to get maybe controversial, but when our kids go to worship on Sunday mornings, I think it should look different than the rest of our lives. I don't think it should be a carbon copy of whatever's faddish in our society. I think that helps. I think the different ways that we worship, the different liturgies that we have, whether high church or low church, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, I think as we raise our families, so this is something different, it's good, it's beautiful, the more we can bring them into that, I think the better off we'll be. That will pay dividends down the line. So we are to be in the world, but not of the world. Our lives should look different. Part of that will be logic, argument, all very important. But even more important, Jesus told parables more so than he gave us, syllogisms. So I think that's kind of what we need to focus on.
Yeah, thanks, Micah. We've heard about Lewis and Maritain and Lewis and Orwell and even Lewis and Tolkien a little bit. I wonder if you could say a little bit about Lewis and Ayn Rand. I know that she commented on what was Mere Christianity, but did he engage her directly, or yeah?
So I can punt on this one a little bit too. I'm privileged to get to do these little talks every now and then. I'm really not in demand. You can find me. But I did get to go to the University of Texas at Austin, and there was an event there hosted by Justin Dyer, who's my co-author on the Lewis book, and it was Ayn Rand and C.S. Lewis in conversation. And it wasn't quite a debate, but it was a lively discussion with the president of the Ayn Rand Society. And I think it was abolition, that we have her marginalia. So if you Google Ayn Rand marginalia, it'll have all the books that she's written in, and her, I cannot repeat some of the words she uses to describe Lewis in abolition. I think it's abolition. So she definitely did not like him. There is no evidence that I am aware of that he knew she existed. And I'd be surprised. And I don't want to make anyone feel bad if you are, or at one point in your life, probably when you're younger, an Ayn Rand fan. But I don't think he could have stomached reading just the quality of the prose and the writing. So that's a somewhat snarky, partisan Lewis side of the argument answer that I don't think he knew about her, but she definitely knew about him, and he got under her skin. So yeah, it's a long Q&A, isn't it? Yeah.
I think that would be the last question.
Okay.
Thank you. I have a couple closing announcements. One is that the Acton Annual Dinner is on October 30th next week. The next lecture in this series will be on November 19th at noon with Dr. William Easterly, who will be talking about beyond material progress, markets and dignity in the fight against global poverty. That's a free event concurrent with the 2024 virtual Poverty Cure Summit. That online Poverty Cure Summit will be November 19th as well. And you can see and register for these and other upcoming events at acton.org/events. Please fill out the event survey by scanning the QR code on the screen, or not. And remember to turn in your name tags on the way out. And just to add, we're running an academic colloquium sponsored by the Journal of Markets and Morality all day. So those of you who came just for the noontime lecture and lunch, if you'd like to stick around and hear more interesting papers and hang out with professors, which is great and fun, and everybody should do that, you're free to stay. Thank you.